What if I told you there was once a king so disfigured, so physically broken, that his own people believed he had been cursed by the devil himself? His name was Charles II of Spain. Imagine this, the ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the world, yet his appearance was so disturbing that even those closest to him whispered that he was bewitched. In fact, that became his nickname, El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. But here's the truth. Charles wasn't haunted by evil spirits or cursed by dark magic. His curse was something far more real and far more terrifying. It came from within his very own bloodline. This is the story of how Europe's most dominant royal dynasty managed to destroy itself from the inside, creating a king so deformed, so fragile, that when he finally died, his autopsy revealed horrors that made every superstition about him seem almost believable. And before we dive in, if you want more of these raw, unfiltered stories that textbooks usually leave out, make sure you subscribe, because today we're pulling back the curtain on one of the darkest chapters of royal history.
1. The jaw that couldn't close.
Picture this, you're a foreign ambassador sent to meet the ruler of the Spanish Empire, the most powerful monarchy in Europe. You enter the grand hall expecting majesty, dignity, and strength. And then the king walks in, but something is wrong. His jaw juts forward so severely that his lips don't touch. His mouth just hangs open, slack and unshut, like a door that's come off its hinges. That was Charles II. This wasn't some random accident of nature. It was the predictable result of 200 years of inbreeding, all thanks to the Habsburg dynasty's obsession with keeping their pure royal bloodline intact. What they called preserving the family was in reality playing a deadly game of genetic Russian roulette. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. In some cases, the family tree folded back on itself so many times that one person could literally be their own cousin, multiple times over. Charles's own parents, an uncle and his niece, his grandparents, also uncle and niece. Go back far enough and you'll see just how little fresh blood entered the Habsburg line. By the time Charles was born, his genetic makeup looked like the DNA of someone whose family had been isolated on a deserted island for centuries. The result of all this, what doctors today call mandibular prognathism, but what history remembers as the Habsburg jaw. His lower jaw protruded so far forward that even when he tried to close his mouth, there was still a gap wide enough to slide a coin through. His teeth didn't line up at all. The top row sat behind the bottom row, making chewing nearly impossible. Now, eating for Charles wasn't just inconvenient, it was humiliating. Every meal was a disaster waiting to happen. Palace cooks had to prepare food in mushy, baby-like textures, pureed and mashed until it was soft enough for him to swallow. Even then, the act of eating was a laborious, messy ordeal. Soups dribbled from the corners of his mouth, and solid food often tumbled right out. Royal banquets, which were supposed to showcase grandeur and elegance, turned into disturbing spectacles. Servants stood by with cloths, constantly wiping saliva and food from the king's chin. And speech? That was even worse. The same jaw deformity that made chewing impossible also made talking nearly incomprehensible. His words came out garbled, slurred and wet, so much so that even his own courtiers often couldn't understand him. Foreign diplomats needed interpreters not because of language differences, but because the Spanish king's speech was virtually indecipherable. It gets darker. Letters from Queen Mariana, Charles's own mother, reveal that she lived in constant fear that her son might choke to death in his sleep, literally suffocate on his own tongue. Imagine that, the ruler of the largest empire on earth considered a nightly choking hazard. And here's the truly damning part. The Habsburgs weren't ignorant. They knew their obsessive inbreeding was producing more and more sickly, deformed heirs. They saw the effects. And yet they kept going, generation after generation. Power, prestige, and control outweighed the suffering of their children. By the time Charles was born, he wasn't just a king, he was a living example of what happens when humans gamble recklessly with genetics to a body that defied nature. As shocking as the Habsburg jaw was, it was only the beginning. Charles's entire body was warped by generations of genetic damage to the point that his very existence seemed to mock the natural order. By the age of 30, Charles resembled not a grown man in his prime, but a sickly child stretched into awkward adulthood. He barely reached 5 feet in height, and his proportions were grotesquely distorted. His head was massive compared to his frail frame, bobbing unsteadily on a thin neck that looked too weak to carry its weight. His arms and legs were stick-thin, almost skeletal, while his torso was hunched and compressed. Walking was a challenge for him from the start. Most children take their first steps around 1 year old. Charles? He didn't manage to walk until he was 8. 8 years old, and even then, walking was generous. His movement was more of a stumbling shuffle, described in palace records as a lurch from wall to wall, using furniture as crutches. His spine was so badly curved that he seemed permanently bent over, as if burdened by an invisible weight. And in a way he was, the weight of centuries of inbreeding crushing down on one unlucky man. But the physical deformities were only part of the tragedy. Mentally, Charles was equally damaged. Well into adulthood, he had the mind of a child. He couldn't read until the age of 10, and even after that, reading remained a painful struggle. His tutors described trying to teach him as filling a broken vessel. Knowledge poured in, but nothing stayed. His emotions reflected the same childlike fragility. Servants recorded episodes where Charles would erupt in violent tantrums over trivial frustrations, screaming, kicking, and thrashing like a toddler denied a toy. Then, just as suddenly, he would sink into hours of vacant silence, staring blankly into space, unreachable and unresponsive. Even his hair bore signs of degeneration. It grew thin, patchy, and brittle, falling out in uneven clumps. His scalp was described by attendants as resembling diseased animal hide more than the crown of a monarch. Portrait painters were forced to take generous artistic liberties, trying to mask what could not be hidden. But even their most flattering works couldn't erase the reality. And the worst part, unlike most people whose bodies stabilize in adulthood, Charles's health only declined further as he aged. His body, already weak, continued to deteriorate as if every cell was fighting against existence. Doctors at the time had no explanation. What they witnessed was a human being whose genetics had failed so catastrophically that his very biology seemed determined to shut him down. Charles II of Spain wasn't just a sick king. He was living proof of what happens when absolute power is preserved at the expense of human survival itself. 3. The king who couldn't make heirs. Now here's where Charles II's tragedy becomes more than just a personal nightmare. It became a continental crisis. You see, in a monarchy, a king has one job above all others: produce heirs. And Charles, he couldn't. He married not once but twice in desperate attempts to secure the dynasty's future. His first wife was Marie Louise of Orléans, a French princess. Imagine her journey. She leaves her homeland expecting to wed the powerful King of Spain, only to find herself tied to a man who looked broken, spoke with slurred words, and struggled even with basic physical functions. The wedding night, a complete disaster. Servants whispered that Marie-Louise emerged from the bedchamber in tears, while Charles appeared bewildered and distressed. The truth, hidden behind courtly secrecy, was brutal. The same genetic mutations that had wrecked his body also left him sexually impotent. His reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that doctors later described them as infantile. In essence, Charles had the sexual maturity of a child trapped inside an adult's body. But of course, the Spanish court couldn't admit that the problem lay with the king. Instead, they blamed Marie-Louise. She was subjected to cruel fertility treatments, endless medical examinations, and the shame of being called barren. She was forced to drink foul herbal concoctions, endure painful procedures, and live under constant pressure to produce an heir that was biologically impossible. The psychological toll on her was devastating. Once described as lively and intelligent, Marie-Louise withered into depression. She prayed obsessively, begging God for a miracle that would never come. Historians even suggest that the fertility treatments may have been so toxic that they slowly poisoned her. She died suddenly at just 26 years old, her health broken and her spirit crushed. Charles remarried quickly, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. But if the first marriage had been tragic, the second was pure desperation. By then, Charles was already in his 30s, his health deteriorating faster each year. Maria Anna wrote letters describing her horror at her husband's frailty and her dawning realization that producing an heir was impossible. The Spanish court tried everything. They summoned physicians from across Europe, consulted ancient fertility texts, and even dabbled in magical remedies. Charles endured humiliating medical inspections where doctors prodded his genitals, trying to diagnose what couldn't be fixed. Nothing worked. Because the problem wasn't external, it was written into his DNA. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe was watching closely. Everyone knew what would happen when Charles died without children. The Spanish throne, one of the richest and most coveted in Europe, would be up for grabs. And the great powers of the continent, France, Austria, England, were already preparing their armies to seize it. It's almost poetic in a cruel way. The Habsburgs had spent centuries obsessively controlling marriages to preserve their dynasty, to keep power in the family. And yet their final king couldn't even consummate a marriage. The very purity they valued so highly had destroyed their bloodline from within. 4. Exorcisms in the royal palace. When science failed to explain Charles II, the Spanish court turned to something even more dramatic: religion. If medicine had no answers, then surely the king must be plagued by demons. And so began some of the strangest spectacles ever performed in a royal palace: public exorcisms on a reigning monarch. The church declared that Charles wasn't just sick, he was possessed. Father Froilan Diaz, the court's chief exorcist, claimed that multiple demons had taken up residence inside the king's body, planted there by witchcraft. And these weren't small, quiet rituals done in secret chapels. No. These were full-blown ceremonies staged in the throne room, with nobles and foreign envoys forced to watch as their king writhed and moaned on the floor. Here's how one of these exorcisms would go. Father Diaz would begin by making Charles drink holy water mixed with powdered relics, bits of bone and other fragments from saints. In reality, Charles was drinking dirty water laced with ground-up debris, which made him violently ill. He would vomit, convulse, and sometimes pass out, while the priest shouted that the demons were fighting against the holy relics. The ceremonies dragged on for hours. Priests pressed crucifixes against his skin until he screamed, drenched him in holy water, and forced him to repeat prayers in Latin, a language he barely understood given his intellectual limitations. But the exorcists didn't stop there. They soon declared that the entire royal palace was cursed. In 1698, Father Diaz launched what can only be described as a supernatural house cleaning. Servants collected items suspected of being tainted, possessions of former queens, gifts from foreign courts, even furniture. All of it was carried into the palace courtyard and burned in massive bonfires, while priests chanted and sprinkled holy water. And here's the unsettling part. Charles believed it was working. With his limited mental capacity and constant suffering, he clung to any sign of hope. Whenever priests told him that demons had been expelled, he would temporarily feel relief, convincing him to beg for more exorcisms whenever his pain returned. The peak came in 1699 when Father Diaz claimed he had cast out not 1, not 10, but 47 demons from Charles's body, each supposedly responsible for different parts of his condition. The ordeal left Charles so exhausted that he collapsed and didn't speak for 3 days afterward. In reality, of course, the exorcisms were nothing more than medieval torture disguised as spiritual healing. What Charles truly needed was modern medicine, but 17th century science simply wasn't capable of understanding his condition. While priests shouted prayers and nobles watched in horrified fascination, the king's body was continuing its slow collapse day after day. 5. The autopsy that shocked Europe. When Charles II finally died in 1700 at the age of 38, Spain faced a moment of terrible reckoning. For decades, they had hidden behind superstition and denial, insisting that their king's condition was the work of witchcraft. But now, with his body on the autopsy table, the truth could no longer be ignored. What the royal physicians discovered was so horrifying that the report was initially suppressed. They feared it would cause scandal, or worse, reinforce the belief that Charles truly had been cursed. But eventually the details leaked, and Europe was stunned. Dr. Jerónimo de la Fuente Piñuelas, the physician who performed the examination, described a body more monstrous than human. His heart was abnormally tiny, no larger than a walnut, shriveled and blackened like burnt meat. For comparison, a normal adult heart weighs about 300 grams. Charles's seemed to weigh less than 50. How he had managed to keep blood circulating for nearly 4 decades was a mystery in itself. His lungs were decayed and gangrenous, filled with fluids and rotting tissue that emitted a stench so vile that assistants fled the room. His intestines were putrid, riddled with infection and disease. And then came the reproductive organs, the very organs on which the fate of Spain had depended. They were catastrophically underdeveloped, confirming what his wives and doctors had long suspected, but never dared admit publicly. Charles had never been capable of fathering children. The final discovery lay within his skull. When doctors opened it, they found his brain surrounded by an abnormal amount of fluid, a condition we now call hydrocephalus. His brain tissue itself was discolored and damaged, explaining his lifelong intellectual disabilities and erratic behavior. Dr. Piñuelas concluded with chilling words. "It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single healthy organ." The irony was brutal. For decades, people had whispered that Charles was bewitched. The autopsy, instead of putting those rumors to rest, seemed to confirm them in the minds of many. How else could someone survive with organs this destroyed unless dark forces were at play? And yet, there was no magic involved. It was biology. Genetics pushed past their breaking point. 6. The legacy of a broken king. Charles II's death didn't just mark the end of a tragic life. It triggered a crisis that would engulf Europe in bloodshed. With no heir to take the Spanish throne, every major power on the continent staked a claim. France, Austria, England, and other nations prepared to enforce those claims with armies, and what followed was the War of the Spanish Succession, a devastating conflict that lasted more than a decade. Hundreds of thousands died, all because one man's body and one family's obsession with pure blood had failed to produce an heir. It's almost unthinkable. The Habsburgs spent centuries carefully arranging marriages, plotting alliances, and concentrating power in their bloodline. They wanted to control Europe through genetics, and yet their final king couldn't perform the one duty that mattered most to a monarch, continuing the dynasty. Their obsession with blood purity didn't just fail, it destroyed their empire's future. Charles II's story is a chilling reminder of how absolute power and rigid tradition can turn inward, becoming self-destructive. In their attempt to control genetics, the Habsburgs created a living experiment in human suffering. A king whose body betrayed him at every turn, whose mind remained trapped in a childlike state, and whose inability to produce an heir destabilized the entire continent. 7. The psychological toll. But the tragedy wasn't limited to Charles himself. His condition cast a shadow over everyone around him. Wives, courtiers, servants, and foreign diplomats all suffered in ways that are hard to imagine. Marie-Louise, forced into impossible fertility treatments and public humiliation, spent her short life under constant psychological torment. Maria Anna, witnessing Charles's decline, lived in fear, despair, and hopelessness, understanding that producing an heir was an impossibility. The palace itself became a place of trauma. Exorcisms and forced rituals transformed the royal residence into something out of a horror story. Servants witnessed their king writhe, vomit, and convulse as priests screamed over him, all while being told the king was possessed by 47 demons. Children, servants, and nobles alike were forced into an environment of fear, superstition, and relentless cruelty. And yet, despite all of this, Charles survived. For 38 years, he endured unimaginable physical pain, intellectual struggle, and emotional torment. He became the center of a court that treated him simultaneously with fear, pity, and frustration. And even as Europe waited for his death, he persisted, a grim symbol of human fragility and the hidden cost of power. 8. The irony of belief. Perhaps the most haunting part of Charles II's story is the way history has interpreted his life. During his reign, people genuinely believed he was cursed by supernatural forces. Exorcisms were performed publicly. Priests and courtiers explained his deformities as proof of demonic possession. And when he died, the autopsy revealed that while there were no demons, there were also no organs in his body that weren't damaged in some way. It's a strange, almost poetic twist. The Habsburgs spent generations trying to control destiny through selective marriages and alliances, yet in the end, destiny, through biology, had the final word. Superstition and fear filled the gap left by medical ignorance. But the truth was even more terrifying than any ghost story. Charles II survived decades of extreme physical and intellectual limitations in a body that was literally failing from the inside out. The irony is heartbreaking. People assumed he was bewitched, when in reality, the curse was entirely human-made. The obsession with keeping bloodlines pure had created a living nightmare. His life stands as a cautionary tale, not about magic, not about divine punishment, but about the consequences of generations of power prioritized over human well-being. 9. Lessons from a tragic reign. Looking back, Charles II's reign forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Absolute power comes at a cost. Obsessive control over heredity and politics can have unintended, catastrophic consequences. And perhaps most poignantly, the Habsburg obsession with genetic purity illustrates the dangers of prioritizing legacy over humanity. His life also exposes the vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals. Charles ruled one of the largest empires in the world, yet he was powerless against his own body. For 38 years, he carried the burden of centuries of familial ambition and miscalculation. His frailty, both physical and mental, defined his reign, shaping the political, social, and military events of Europe for decades after his death. The War of Spanish Succession is just one example. Millions died in conflicts sparked by a succession crisis caused entirely by a biological inability to produce an heir. And yet, Charles himself, in the midst of unimaginable suffering, remained a human being, not just a historical footnote. He endured ridicule, fear, and isolation in a world that demanded perfection from him while simultaneously exploiting his condition for political ends. 10. The dark human cost of power. The story of Charles II also forces us to examine the personal human cost of power. Royalty and monarchy often seem glamorous in textbooks and media. Grand palaces, ornate ceremonies, endless influence. But in Charles's case, power was inseparable from suffering. Every royal decree, every courtly interaction, every ceremonial obligation was a test of endurance against a body and mind that were failing him from birth. He could not eat like a normal man. He could not speak clearly. He could not walk or stand like other adults. And he could not produce an heir. And still, he was king. People feared him, pitied him, and tried desperately to control him, but none of that changed the reality. He was biologically, mentally, and emotionally fragile. And yet, in a grim, paradoxical way, there is something awe-inspiring about his endurance. Despite being a living embodiment of genetic failure, he survived for nearly 4 decades, maintaining the facade of kingship under circumstances that would have broken most people in weeks, if not days. 11. The lasting legacy. When Charles II finally died, Europe erupted into chaos. Wars were fought, borders redrawn, and millions of lives lost, all triggered by one man's inability to produce an heir. The Habsburgs' centuries-long obsession with concentrated power ended in a bitter irony. Their final king's physical and genetic failures caused the collapse of the very system they had built. Charles II's life and death are a stark reminder of how human ambition can collide with human biology. He was the tragic endpoint of a dynasty that placed power above humanity, and his story is one of the most extreme examples in history of how obsession with control can backfire in catastrophic ways. More than 3 centuries later, Charles II remains a cautionary tale. His reign forces us to confront the fragility of life, the limits of human control, and the unpredictable consequences of decisions made in the name of power. He wasn't cursed by demons, he wasn't bewitched. He was a man made tragic by human hands, a victim of ambition, tradition, and the cruel lottery of genetics. If these dark corners of royal history fascinate you, think about what we often overlook in the stories of power and legacy. Charles II is not just a historical curiosity, he's a reminder that sometimes the most formidable enemies of kings and empires are not revolutions, armies, or even foreign enemies. They are the forces of biology and the consequences of choices made centuries earlier. If this story captivated you, hit that like button, subscribe for more shocking historical secrets, and tell me in the comments, what other royal mysteries should I uncover next? Because history isn't always what it seems, and some truths are far stranger and far darker than fiction.